Take
The
it.
most dangerous man in
And be more
Seoul
careful
didn't care
next
about
time.
money, and he didn't care about power. What he cared about was 9 p.m. Every night,
Take
like
it.
clockwork, the Dragon
more
of
careful
Seoul,
next time.
Yoon Jae-hyuk, would clear his penthouse of his lieutenants and wait. His men whispered in the
Take it.
shadows. Was it a
And be
secret
more careful
informant?
next time.
A high-stakes deal? But when the buzzer finally rang, it wasn't a hitman at the door.
Take it.
It was a girl in a faded
more
red
careful
cap,
next time.
holding a grease-stained pizza box. Tonight, the routine was about to break.
Take
Tonight, the dragon wouldn't
be more
just take the
careful next
pizza.
time.
He would see the one thing he had tried for years to forget. Jae-hyuk pulled the door open,
Take
his
it.
towering, tattooed
And be
frame
more
casting a
careful next
shadow that seemed to swallow the hallway. Any other delivery driver would have run, but Lila Monroe
Take it.
didn't even look up.
And be more
She
careful
stood there,
next time.
her face smudged with city grime, her eyes glazed with a bone-deep exhaustion that no 20-year-old should ever
be more
know.
careful next time.
As she handed over the $15 box, her hand trembled, not from fear of the Mafia boss, but from the weight of 3 jobs and a stomach that hadn't seen a full meal in days. Jae-hyuk looked at her hands, the hands of a former piano prodigy, now cracked and cold. He pulled out a stack of bills that could pay her rent for a year, but when he reached out, she flinched, whispering the words that tore through his cold exterior. "I'm sorry it's late. Please don't report me. My brother needs the medicine tonight." His chest tightened. A burning regret he thought he'd buried 10 years ago flared to life. This wasn't just a delivery girl. She was the living ghost of the family he had accidentally destroyed. For a long moment, the most feared man in the underworld said nothing. He didn't take the pizza. Instead, he did something that would leave his guards, his rivals, and the entire city of Seoul absolutely speechless. Stay with me until the end, because the secret Yoon Jae-hyuk was hiding behind those nightly pizza orders will break your heart, and what he did next changed Lila's life forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into the dark truth of the dragon's debt. The elevator was a vertical streak of brushed chrome and silence, rising so fast that Lila felt her stomach linger somewhere near the lobby. She adjusted the brim of her red wool cap, tugging it lower over her ears. It was a cheap thing, frayed at the edges and smelling faintly of the lavender detergent her mother used, but it felt like a shield in a building made of glass and cold ambition. When the doors slid open with a polite, melodic chime, she stepped onto a carpet so thick it threatened to swallow her sneakers. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum dedicated to the concept of unreachable. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, where the sunset was currently bleeding bruised purples and golds over the skyline. "You're late," a voice drifted from the far side of the room. Lila turned, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized jacket. Mr. Sterling was silhouetted against the dying light, a glass of something amber in his hand. He didn't look like the titan of industry the news portrayed. He looked tired, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a silk waistcoat. "The subway stalled at 42nd, Lila said, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the vaulted ceiling. "I'm sorry." He waved a hand, a dismissive gesture that seemed to erase the distance between them. "Sit, please." Lila chose a chair that looked more like a piece of modern sculpture than furniture. As she sat, she felt the stark contrast of her existence, the girl who lived in a 4th-floor walk-up with a leaking radiator, now sitting in a room where a single rug likely cost more than her neighborhood's entire block. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Lila realized he wasn't looking at her, but at the red cap. It was a jarring splash of color in his monochrome world of grays, blacks, and whites. "My daughter had a hat like that," Sterling said, his voice losing its edge. Though hers was silk. She hated the itch of wool. Lila reached up, touching the fabric. "My mom knitted this. It's not silk, but it keeps the heat in." Sterling finally turned to face her, his eyes scanning her with a curiosity that wasn't unkind, just distant. "And why are you here, Lila?" "Beyond the delivery." She reached into her bag and pulled out the weathered leather ledger her father had kept until the day his heart gave out. It was the reason she'd navigated the maze of security guards and mahogany desks to get here. "My father always said you were a man who kept his word," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. He said that even if the world forgot the little people, you wouldn't. She walked across the expanse of the room, her sneakers squeaking softly, and placed the book on the marble coffee table. Sterling looked down at it, then back at the girl in the red cap. For a moment, the high-altitude wind rattled the glass, a reminder of how fragile the sanctuary truly was. He was a dreamer, Sterling murmured, touching the cover of the ledger with a trembling finger. A dangerous thing to be in this city. It's only dangerous if you're dreaming alone, Lila replied. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the penthouse into a twilight of soft shadows. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. Sterling wasn't just the man in the ivory tower, and Lila wasn't just the girl from the streets. They were two people tethered together by a ghost and a debt that couldn't be paid in currency. Sterling looked up, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I suppose we should get to work then. Lila nodded, pulling her cap a little tighter. The air up here was thin, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. The ledger sat between them like a live wire, humming with the weight of decades. Mr. Sterling didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at the red wool of Lila's cap as if it were a beacon from a shoreline he had long ago abandoned. The silence of the penthouse was no longer oppressive. It had turned clinical, expectant, like the air in a room before a surgeon makes the first cut. Your father was a meticulous man, Lila, Sterling said, finally reaching for a heavy fountain pen on the table. He saw the threads that held this city together. Most people just see the fabric. He saw the grime in the stitching. He didn't look at the ledger's contents to verify the debt. He didn't check the dates or the signatures. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a small, leather-bound clip. With a practiced, rhythmic flick of his thumb, he peeled off 10 crisp, $100 bills. He laid them on the marble surface, one by one, overlapping like scales. Lila stared at the money. To Sterling, it was the cost of a mediocre bottle of wine. To her, it was 4 months of rent, a new winter coat for her mother, and a refrigerator that didn't groan like a dying animal every time the compressor kicked in. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. That's not the debt, Mr. Sterling, she whispered, her voice cracking. The ledger says. The ledger is a map, Lila. This, he gestured to the stack of currency, is a tip. For the delivery. For the cold walk. For being the only person in this zip code who doesn't look at me like I'm a mountain to be climbed. He pushed the money toward her. It slid easily over the polished stone. Take it. Consider it a down payment on the truth, he added, his eyes darkening. Lila hesitated, then gathered the bills. They felt unnervingly heavy. She tucked them into the deep pocket of her jacket, her hand staying there, gripping the paper as if it might dissolve if she let go. She made her way back to the elevator, the transition from the golden warmth of the penthouse to the sterile metal box feeling like a fall from grace. As she stepped out into the lobby, the atmosphere had shifted. The concierge, a man whose spine usually seemed reinforced with steel, stood frozen. The 2 security guards by the revolving doors weren't looking at the monitors, they were looking at her. News in a building like the Sterling Tower didn't travel through wires. It moved through the vents, through the whispers of assistance, through the invisible psychic network of the help. They knew. By the time she reached the sidewalk, the air felt electric. A black sedan was idling at the curb, and a man she recognized from the neighborhood, a fixer named Elias, who usually dealt in stolen watches and silence, was leaning against a lamppost. He watched her with a predatory curiosity. The word had already hit the pavement. The girl in the red cap had walked into the lion's den and walked out with a tribute. $1,000 tip wasn't just a gesture of kindness in their world. It was a signal. It was a flag planted in the dirt. To the underworld watching from the shadows of the fire escapes, that money wasn't currency, it was a target. Lila walked faster, her hand still white-knuckled around the cash in her pocket. The city felt different now. The shadows were longer, and the faces in the crowd seemed to turn toward her like sunflowers following a dark sun. She had entered the penthouse as a messenger, but as she descended into the mouth of the subway, she realized she was leaving as a prize. The $1,000 wasn't a gift. It was the loudest thing anyone had ever said without opening their mouth. The smell of burnt ozone and expensive floor wax always heralded Julian's worst moods. He sat in the center of the subterranean workshop, the harsh fluorescent lights bouncing off the chrome surfaces of half-finished automatons that looked more like skeletal remains than miracles of engineering. In his hand, a delicate brass gear was being crushed slowly between his thumb and forefinger. Julian was a man built on the scaffolding of his own expectations. At 24, he was already being called the architect of the new age, but the weight of that title had begun to splinter his bones. He stared at the blueprint spread across the mahogany table, a design for a self-sustaining kinetic engine that had stalled for 3 weeks. The math was perfect, the logic was sound, yet the machine refused to breathe. It's missing a soul, isn't it? Julian didn't turn around. He knew the soft, rhythmic click of Alara's boots on the metal grating. She was the only one allowed in the vault when the deadbolts were thrown. Soul isn't a variable in thermodynamics, Alara, he snapped, though the bite in his voice lacked its usual venom. He finally dropped the mangled gear. It hit the floor with a hollow, pathetic chime. It's a friction error. Somewhere in the third stage, energy is bleeding into the casing. I've recalculated the tolerances 5 times. Alara moved closer, her presence a calm counterpoint to the frantic energy vibrating off him. She didn't look at the blueprints. Instead, she looked at his hands. They were stained with oil and shaking a fine, rhythmic tremor that spoke of too many stimulants and not enough sleep. "You're trying to build a god in a basement," she said softly, reaching out to steady his arm. "The world expects you to be a prodigy, Julian, but you're treating yourself like a prototype. You can't just swap out your parts when you burn out." Julian pulled away, pacing the length of the room. The frustration was a physical thing, a fever burning behind his eyes. He had been the golden child of the academy, the boy who solved the Maxwell equations before he could drive, but the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. Now, every failed experiment felt like a public execution. He wasn't just afraid of being wrong, he was terrified of being ordinary. "If I don't finish this, the funding pulls back. If the funding pulls back, the lab closes. And if the lab closes..." He stopped, staring at his reflection in the polished glass of a display case. He looked gaunt, a ghost haunted by his own potential. "I'm just a man with a lot of expensive scrap metal." "You're a man who hasn't seen the sun in 4 days, Alara countered, her voice firm. She stepped into his line of sight, forcing him to meet her eyes. "The machine isn't broken, Julian. You are. You're pushing the metal to do things it wasn't meant to do because you're trying to outrun your own shadow." He wanted to argue. He wanted to throw a wrench through the glass and scream that she didn't understand the pressure of carrying a revolution on one's shoulders. But as he looked at her, the anger drained out of him, leaving only a vast, cold exhaustion. He sank into his swivel chair, his head dropping into his hands. The silence of the workshop felt heavy, filled with the ghosts of ideas that had never quite made it to reality. For the first time in years, the prodigy felt small. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered into his palms. "If I'm not moving forward, I feel like I'm disappearing." Alara stepped behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was grounded, a reminder of the world outside the blueprints and the gears. "Then let yourself disappear for a night. The engine will still be broken tomorrow. But maybe, if you breathe, you'll actually see why." Julian closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the cooling vents. The pressure was still there, a dull ache in his chest, but for a moment, the need to be perfect was eclipsed by the simple, human need to be still. The stillness of the workshop was a lie. Julian eventually fell into a fitful sleep, his head resting on the blueprints, but Alara remained awake, a silent sentinel in the dim glow of the emergency lights. She knew what Julian refused to acknowledge. Brilliance was a beacon, and beacons drew predators. She moved to the perimeter of the room, her footsteps making no sound on the reinforced steel. While Julian was the architect of the future, Alara was the curator of his survival. She reached into the shadow of a heavy equipment locker and pulled out a sleek, matte black console, the interface for the Aegis system, a network of sensors and countermeasures Julian had built but forgotten in his pursuit of the kinetic engine. The screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a cool blue light. She scrolled through the logs of the last hour. To a casual observer, the data showed nothing but the ambient noise of a city settling into the night. But Alara saw the patterns. A rhythmic pulse in the local power grid, a momentary lag in the external camera feeds, a heat signature that lingered a second too long near the ventilation shafts. They were being watched. They were always being watched. She didn't wake him. Julian's mind was a glass clockwork. If she startled him now, the gears might never realign. Instead, she adjusted her posture, her hand sliding instinctively to the concealed holster at her hip. Her role as his assistant was a necessary fiction, a mask that allowed her to stay close enough to catch him when he tripped over his own genius. In reality, she was the invisible guard, the wall between the boy wonder and the organizations that wanted to turn his dreams into munitions. A soft scratching sound echoed from the vents above, too heavy for a rat, too deliberate for the wind. Alara didn't flinch. She simply tapped a command into the console, activating a localized ultrasonic dampener. The scratching stopped instantly, followed by a muffled thud of someone, or something, retreating in confusion. She watched the heat signature on the monitor fade as the intruder moved back toward the alleyway. They were testing the perimeter again. They were getting bolder because they sensed the cracks in Julian's composure. A broken prodigy was easier to kidnap than a confident one. "You should be sleeping too," Julian murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. He hadn't lifted his head, but his eyes were open, tracking the blue glow of her screen. "I sleep with my eyes open," Alara replied, her tone softening, but her gaze never leaving the monitors. "It's a job requirement." Julian pushed himself up, rubbing the red ink of the blueprints off his cheek. He looked at the security. He wasn't like the crude extraction teams that had poked at the perimeter earlier. They were blunt instruments, sent by desperate men to see if the door was unlocked. The stalker was a surgeon. He had been tracking Julian for months, documenting the precise moment the prodigy's genius began to tilt into madness. He knew Julian's favorite brand of coffee, the exact cadence of his nervous pacing, and the way he looked at Alara when he thought he was alone. The stalker reached into a small leather kit and withdrew a delicate, spider-like drone no larger than a coin. With a flick of his wrist, the device caught the wind, its blackened rotors whispering as it began its descent toward the workshop's ventilation intake. He didn't need to break in, not yet. He only needed to listen. As the drone docked against the iron grating, the stalker's screen flooded with audio data. He heard the scratch of Julian's pencil, a sound like a frantic insect against paper. He heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man on the edge of a collapse. "The kinetic engine," the stalker murmured, reading the heat signatures of the machinery through the walls. So much fire in such a small box. He reached out and touched the glass of his monitor, his gloved finger tracing the outline of Julian's slumped silhouette. There was a strange sort of kinship in his gaze, a predator's appreciation for a rare specimen. He had seen many geniuses, but Julian was different. Julian was building something that would shift the balance of power in the city, and the stalker had been hired to ensure that when the engine finally turned over, the hand on the throttle belonged to his employers. But as he watched Alara move across the room on his secondary feed, his eyes narrowed. She was the variable he couldn't quite solve. Her movements were too precise, her awareness too sharp for a mere assistant. She was a professional, perhaps even a peer. "You're the armor," he whispered to the screen, his thumb hovering over a detonator switch for a distraction charge he'd planted days ago. "But every suit of armor has a seam." He checked his watch. The sun would rise in 3 hours, bringing with it the noise and chaos of the city, the perfect veil for a disappearance. He folded his kit with practiced efficiency, his movements a blur of practiced shadows. He didn't mind the wait. The best way to catch a bird of prey was to let it exhaust itself against the bars of its own cage first. Down in the vault, Julian suddenly looked up, a chill skittering down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He stared at the ceiling, at the dark mouth of the vent where the drone sat perched like a leech. The stalker drew a jagged knife and began to sharpen it against a whetstone, the rhythmic shink-shink-shink echoing the heartbeat of the man he was about to break. The hunt was no longer a matter of if, but when. The workshop's kitchen was a cramped, sterile alcove that smelled of stale espresso and the metallic tang of a failing refrigerator. It was a neutral zone, or at least it was supposed to be. Julian stood before the counter, his trembling hands struggling to steady a porcelain mug as the coffee machine hissed and sputtered. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a dying rhythm, casting long, nervous shadows across the linoleum. He didn't hear Alara enter. He felt the shift in the air pressure, the way the room seemed to tighten around her presence. She didn't stay by the door this time. She walked directly into his personal space, her expression a mask of hard, unyielding glass. "You're vibrating, Julian," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And it's not the caffeine." Julian laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked in the small space. "I'm close, Alara. The stalker, the drones, the shadows, they're all distractions. If I can just bridge the gap between the primary coil and the discharge." "Stop," she commanded. She reached out, her fingers locking around his wrist with the strength of a vice. The mug rattled against the counter. "Look at me. Not the blueprints in your head. Look at me." Julian's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes bloodshot and wide. For a second, the manic energy faltered, revealing the sheer terror beneath. "He's in the vents, isn't he? I can feel him. Like a cold draft that won't go away." He was, Alara admitted, her grip not loosening. "But he's moved. He's circling, waiting for you to make a mistake. And you're about to give him exactly what he wants because you're losing your mind in pursuit of a ghost." "It's not a ghost. It's the engine," Julian shouted, wrenching his arm away. The movement sent the half-filled mug sliding across the counter, dark liquid splashing onto his white shirt like a Rorschach blot. He didn't seem to notice. "You think I'm a child who needs a nursemaid, but I am the only person in this city who can change the way the world moves. If I stop now, the stalker wins. If I stop, the silence wins." Alara stepped closer, her chest nearly touching his. She didn't flinch at his outburst. Instead, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his hysteria like a scalpel. "The silence is already winning, you idiot. You've stopped listening to your own instincts. You're building a weapon, not a wonder, and you're too blind to see that your employers aren't the only ones waiting for it to be finished. The man on the roof? He doesn't want the engine. He wants the man who can build 10 more. Julian backed away until his spine hit the refrigerator, the humming metal vibrating through his skull. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls closing in. "Then what do you want, Alara? Why are you still here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alara's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something human behind the guard before the steel returned. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive, slamming it onto the counter between them. "I want you to survive the night," she said. "The drive contains the kill code for the lab's internal servers. If they breach the door, I'm wiping everything. Your notes, your designs, your soulless engine. Everything goes to zero." Julian stared at the drive as if it were a live grenade. "You destroy it? My life's work." "I'd destroy the work to save the man," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Because the work can be rebuilt. You can't." The confrontation hovered on a knife's edge. Julian looked from the drive to Alara, seeing for the first time not a protector or an assistant, but a woman who was mourning him before he was even gone. The silence in the kitchen was no longer a vacuum. It was a choice. A heavy thud echoed from the main workshop, the sound of a pressurized seal being forced. The stalker had stopped waiting. "Pick up the drive," Julian, Alara said, her hand moving to the grip of her weapon. "The kitchen is closed." The crash of the workshop's main seal didn't sound like an explosion. It was the groan of yielding metal, a heavy, mechanical sigh that signaled the end of Julian's sanctuary. He stood frozen in the kitchen, the data drive a cold weight in his palm, while Alara moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. She didn't head for the door. Instead, she grabbed the back of Julian's collar and shoved him toward the narrow service crawl space behind the industrial refrigerator. "Get in. Don't make a sound until I come for you," she hissed. "Alara, wait." He was silenced by the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a bodyguard, but of an executioner. He scrambled into the dark, cramped space, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Through the gap in the drywall, he watched as the kitchen door was kicked open. The stalker didn't rush in. He drifted. He moved through the room like smoke, his long tactical coat fluttering behind him. He held a suppressed pistol with a casual, practiced ease, but he didn't point it at the shadows. He pointed it directly at Alara, who stood in the center of the kitchen with her hands empty and raised. "You're late," Alara said, her voice devoid of any fear. Julian's breath hitched. "Late?" The stalker stopped 3 feet from her, his thermal goggles pushed up to reveal eyes that were a piercing, artificial blue. "The perimeter was more tedious than briefed, Commander. You've tightened the security protocols since the last cycle." Julian felt the world tilt. The word commander rang in his ears, a dissonant chord that shattered his reality. He watched, paralyzed, as Alara lowered her hands. She didn't draw her weapon. She didn't attack. She simply stood there, her posture shifting from that of a protective shadow to that of a superior officer. "The asset is unstable," Alara said, her voice cold and clinical, the voice of a scientist discussing a lab rat. "The kinetic engine is 88% complete, but his psychological state is deteriorating faster than the hardware can be refined. I had to initiate the protector persona ahead of schedule to maintain his focus." The stalker holstered his weapon, his movements mirroring her professional coldness. "The board is losing patience. They don't want a broken genius. They want the blueprints. If he can't finish it under your empathy protocol, we move to phase 2. Extraction and forced interrogation." "No," Alara snapped, and for a second, Julian saw a flash of the woman who had held his hand in the dark. "He won't break under torture. He'll shut down. He's a precision instrument. If you crack the casing, the mechanism dies. I need 48 more hours to steer him toward the final calibration." Julian clutched the data drive so hard the plastic bit into his skin. Every word was a needle. The late nights, the comforting whispers, the steady hands that had kept him from the edge. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even a job. It was a controlled environment. He wasn't a man being protected. He was an experiment being cultivated. The invisible guard wasn't there to keep the world out. She was there to keep that asset in. "And if he finds out," the stalker asked, glancing toward the shadows where Julian hid. "The boy is smarter than you give him credit for. He's been looking at the vents." "He sees what I allow him to see," Alara replied, her voice flat. "He's so desperate for a soul in his machines that he's projected one onto me. It's a classic displacement. He thinks I'm the only thing keeping him alive. As long as he believes that, he'll keep working." Julian closed his eyes, a hot, bitter tear tracking through the coffee stain on his cheek. The engine, the workshop, the danger, it was all a theater, a grand stage play designed to keep his genius focused on a single, deadly goal. He wasn't a prodigy. He was a prisoner who had fallen in love with his jailer. "Check the workshop," Alara commanded. "Ensure the breach didn't damage the primary coil. I'll retrieve the asset from the crawl space and tell him I scared you off. He'll be grateful. He'll be productive." As the stalker turned to leave, Julian felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over his panic. The trembling in his hands stopped. He looked at the data drive, the kill code Alara had given him. She had told him she would destroy the work to save the man. Now he knew the truth. She was the work, and the man was already gone. The darkness of the crawl space was no longer a refuge, it was a tomb. Julian sat in the cramped silence, the data drive pressing against his palm like a jagged piece of glass. Every memory of the last 3 years, every shared meal, every late-night breakthrough, every time Alara had pulled him back from the brink, was being rewritten in real time, stained by the cold, calculated vocabulary of a handler. He wasn't her friend. He was a precision instrument. He heard the stalker's boots recede into the main workshop, followed by the low, mechanical hum of Alara's Aegis system being reset. She was clearing the stage, preparing to put back on the mask of the devoted assistant. In a few moments, she would come to the crawl space, reach out a hand, and offer him a lie wrapped in comfort. Julian looked at the drive. "I'd destroy the work to save the man," she had said. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but there was no warmth in it, only the terrifying clarity of a mind that had finally snapped into a different gear. If he was a machine, he was one she no longer understood how to control. He didn't wait for her to come to him. He crept further back into the service tunnel, toward the auxiliary junction box he had installed 6 months ago during a bout of insomnia. His fingers moved with a rhythmic, lethal precision. He didn't need the light. He knew every copper wire and fiber optic thread of this building. He had designed its nervous system to serve his genius, and now he would use it to commit a beautiful, digital suicide. He slotted the drive into the auxiliary port. The interface didn't ask for a password. Alara had designed the kill code to be a master key, a scorched earth protocol meant to protect the asset from falling into the wrong hands. She had never considered that the asset might use it against his own empire. Julian. Alara's voice called out from the kitchen, soft and brimming with fake concern. It's okay. He's gone. You can come out now. Julian didn't answer. He watched the tiny LED on the junction box turn from amber to a steady, pulsing crimson. Julian. The tone changed. The concern sharpened into a command. He heard the refrigerator being shoved aside, the heavy metal screeching against the floor. I'm not a prototype, Alara, Julian whispered into the dark. He hit the execute command. The building didn't shake, but the sound was unmistakable, a digital roar that began in the basement and surged through the walls. In the main workshop, the kinetic engine's cooling fans wailed as the power grid reversed its flow. On every monitor, lines of code, the work of a decade, began to dissolve into gibberite, overwritten by a recursive loop of zeros. What have you done? Alara's silhouette appeared at the mouth of the crawlspace, her face pale in the strobe light flicker of the failing electronics. For the first time, she looked genuinely terrified. Julian, stop it. You're wiping the servers. The board, they'll kill us both. There is no us, Commander, Julian said, his voice coming from the shadows, hollow and distant. There's just the asset and the architecture. And I'm tearing the building down. A series of small, controlled pops echoed through the walls as the hardware fried. The kinetic engine, his masterpiece, let out a final, melodic chime before its core fused into a useless lump of slag. The blueprints, the research, the secret formulas for the new age, everything that made Julian valuable was evaporating into ozone. The stalker burst back into the room, his blue eyes wide as he watched his mission disintegrate. He looked at Alara, waiting for an order, but she was frozen, staring into the crawl space at the monster she had accidentally finished creating. Julian scrambled out of the other end of the tunnel, popping a maintenance hatch that led directly to the rainy alleyway. He stood in the downpour, the cold water soaking through his stained shirt, feeling the weight of the world finally lift from his shoulders. He was no longer the architect of the new age. He was a man with nothing, and for the first time in his life, he was invisible. Behind him, the lights of the workshop flickered once and then died completely, plunging the empire into total darkness. Julian turned his back on the ruins and began to walk, disappearing into the city's gray fog. The rain did not feel like a burden, it felt like a baptism. Julian walked through the neon-slicked labyrinth of the lower docks, his silhouette merging with the thousands of forgotten souls who haunted the city's edge. Behind him, the smoke from the workshop fire drifted lazily into the clouds, a funeral pyre for the man the world thought it owned. He found shelter beneath the rusted overhang of a decommissioned shipyard. His hands, which had trembled for years under the weight of expectations and stimulants, were now eerily still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of the kinetic engine's primary coil he had pocketed before the purge. It was a useless bit of copper and glass, but in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, it glowed with a faint, residual heat. For his entire life, Julian had been told that his value was etched into his DNA, that his intellect was a biological fluke meant to be harnessed, harvested, and protected like a natural resource. The board viewed him as a sequence of high-functioning proteins. Alara viewed him as a tactical objective. They all believed that if they controlled the environment, they could control the output. They were wrong. He leaned his head back against the cold iron of a shipping container and laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that was lost to the wind. He realized now that genius wasn't a cage of logic, it was the ability to recognize when the logic was a lie. By destroying his work, he hadn't just erased a machine, he had erased the identity they had built for him. He was no longer a prodigy. He was a blank page. A few yards away, a stray dog, scarred and shivering, watched him from the shadows. Julian reached out, not with the calculated precision of a scientist, but with the simple, messy empathy of a human being. He didn't have a formula for this interaction. There was no blueprint for kindness. "We're both off the grid now," he whispered. As the first hints of a gray, uncertain dawn began to bleed through the smog, Julian felt a strange new sensation: peace. The architect was dead, but the man remained. He knew that Alara and the stalker would spend weeks combing through the digital ashes, looking for a ghost that no longer existed. They would check his DNA records, monitor the borders, and scan the facial recognition grids, but they were looking for a person who functioned within their system. Julian was going to build something new, but it wouldn't be made of gears or code. It would be built out of the moments they had tried to steal from him: the quiet of a morning, the anonymity of a crowd, the freedom to be wrong. He stood up, tossed the piece of the coil into the black water of the harbor, and watched the ripples disappear. The board thought they had mapped every inch of his potential, but they had forgotten that a map is not the territory. Beyond the blueprints, beyond the expectations, and far beyond the double helix of his DNA, there was a spark they could never categorize. He turned away from the harbor and began to walk toward the heart of the city, not as a king or a captive, but as a stranger. The world was vast, broken, and beautiful, and for the first time in 24 years, Julian was finally ready to see it. The terminal at the edge of the district was a cavern of concrete and cold air, smelling of diesel and the salt of the nearby sea. It was the kind of place where things were sent to be forgotten, a graveyard for crates that no one ever claimed. Julian stood in the shadow of a rusted crane, watching the morning fog roll in. He looked different. His posture was looser, the frantic spark in his eyes replaced by a heavy, resonant calm. In his hand, he held a single, unassuming package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine. He wasn't waiting for a buyer. He wasn't waiting for the board. The sound of footsteps echoed against the damp pavement, sharp, rhythmic, and unmistakable. Alara emerged from the mist, her black coat slick with moisture. She looked exhausted, the professional sheen of the commander chipped away by 48 hours of failure. She didn't have her weapon drawn. She looked at him not as an asset to be recovered, but as a riddle she had finally admitted she couldn't solve. "I tracked the signature of the auxiliary junction," she said, her voice raspy. "I knew you'd come here. This was the first place we scouted for the lab, 3 years ago." "It's the only place that hasn't been overwritten by your protocols," Julian replied. He didn't move away as she approached. "I wanted to give you something. A final delivery." Alara stopped a few feet from him, her gaze dropping to the package. "The board is already declaring you dead, Julian. The stalker is being reassigned. If you walk away now, you stay a ghost. Why risk coming here? Why give me anything?" "Because you were right about one thing," Julian said, stepping forward to bridge the gap. He held out the package. "I was trying to build a soul into a machine because I didn't know how to find my own. You spent 3 years pretending to be my conscience, my guard, my friend. You played the part so well that, for a while, it was real. Even if it was a lie to you, it was a truth to me." Alara took the package, her fingers trembling slightly, a human tremor he recognized. She slowly unwound the twine and tore back the paper. Inside was a small, hand-wound music box made from the scrap brass of the destroyed kinetic engine. It was crude compared to his usual work, lacking the chrome polish and the complex sensors of his masterpieces. "Open it," he whispered. She lifted the lid. There was no digital melody, no synthesized chords. Instead, the tiny tines plucked out a simple, haunting lullaby Julian's mother had hummed to him before the academy had taken him away. It was a memory that hadn't been in his files, a piece of data his DNA couldn't carry. "It's powered by the heat of your hand," Julian explained. "No batteries. No code. It only plays if someone is holding it." Alara stared at the mechanism, the music box chiming softly in the morning air. "The engine. The designs. You really destroyed them all?" "The world doesn't need that engine, Alara. It needs people who aren't afraid to be still." Julian turned toward the docks, where a weathered freighter was beginning to strain against its moorings. "That box is the last thing I'll ever build for an audience. Consider it my resignation." They'll never stop looking for the architect, she warned, though her voice lacked its usual steel. Julian looked back over his shoulder, a ghost of a smile appearing beneath the hood of his jacket. Let them look. They're looking for a genius. They'll never think to look for a deckhand. He stepped onto the gangplank, disappearing into the bustle of the crew and a thick, protective shroud of the fog. Ilara stood alone on the pier, the music box still playing against her palm. She watched the ship pull away until the silhouette was swallowed by the gray horizon. She looked down at the gift one last time, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her encrypted comms device, the link to the men who pulled the strings of the world. With a decisive click, she dropped the device into the churning black water of the harbor. The delivery was complete. The architect was gone, and for the first time in her life, the guard had nothing left to watch but the rising sun. I hope you enjoyed this journey through Julian's liberation. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from for more captivating stories.